The colony of New Meridian sat on the edge of everything that mattered, and nothing that was safe. A cluster of steel domes and pressurized greenhouses dropped onto a world that did not want them there. And Alara Voss knew this better than most, because she spent more time outside the walls than any other 9-year-old on the planet. Kepler 442b was beautiful in the way that a predator is beautiful. All green canopy and golden light filtering through leaves the size of shuttle doors. Rivers that ran clean and cold through valleys carved by ancient floods. And everywhere beneath the beauty was something with teeth or thorns or venom waiting for the careless and the slow. Alara was neither careless nor slow, but she was curious. And curiosity had a way of dragging her past the perimeter markers her mother had told her never to cross. Her mother was Dr. Cale Voss, one of the colony's 3 xenobiologists, and the only person on New Meridian who could identify all 214 catalogued predator species by sound alone. And she had raised Alara with 2 rules that mattered more than any others. Pay attention to everything, and never assume you are at the top of the food chain. Alara had taken both rules to heart, which was why she was crouched in the mud at the edge of the northern tree line on a Tuesday morning, watching a 6-legged creature the size of a house cat drink from a stream, sketching it in her battered notebook, while something small and angry sat beside her and radiated irritation through the back of her skull. That something was Patches. Patches was a honey badger, and she was the worst thing that had ever happened to Alara's social life. The Companion Bond Initiative had been humanity's answer to a galaxy that outclassed them in every physical category that mattered. Because when humans had first stepped onto the galactic stage, they had discovered a terrible truth. They were not special. They were not strong. They were not fast. They were not armored or venomous, or capable of sensing electromagnetic fields through their skin like the Pelori, or regrowing severed limbs like the Dratha. And every species they encountered looked at them the way a wolf looks at a rabbit, and saw something soft and slow and easy to kill. But humanity had one trick that no other species in the known galaxy had ever developed, one adaptation so strange and so ancient that alien scientists still argued about whether it was even real. Humans made friends, not allies, not servants, not domesticated tools, but genuine cross-species partnerships built on trust and loyalty, and something that the galactic translators could only render as love. And they had been doing it for 40,000 years, ever since the first wolf had crept close to the first campfire and decided that the strange 2-legged creatures throwing scraps were worth staying near. That ancient gift, and wrapped it in technology, using neural symbiotic implants to forge a direct psychic link between a human and their bonded animal. And the implants did not just connect them, they enhanced the animal to its absolute biological peak. Every natural trait pushed to its maximum potential, every strength amplified, every instinct sharpened. Most colonists bonded with impressive creatures, wolves and big cats and birds of prey, animals that made sense as partners on a dangerous frontier world, animals that looked the part. Alara had been matched with a 12-kilogram honey badger with a torn left ear and a personality like a bag of broken glass. The bonding ceremony had been the most embarrassing day of her life, standing in the colony's central hall while the other children received sleek wolves and sharp-eyed hawks, and she got a flat-headed, bow-legged, perpetually furious little monster that had bitten the veterinarian 3 times before the implant was even activated. The soldiers had laughed, not cruelly, but in the way adults laugh when they feel sorry for a child and do not know how to hide it. And Alara had burned with shame until the moment the neural link had snapped into place, and she had felt what Patches felt and understood in a single breathless instant that every person in that room had made a terrible mistake. Because Patches was not weak. Patches was not a joke. Patches was something that the universe had spent millions of years perfecting, and the CBI enhancers had simply removed the last limitations from the honey badger's hide, already thick enough to resist porcupine quills and bee stings and the fangs of cobras, had been reinforced at the molecular level until it could shrug off impacts that would crack bone. Her jaw strength had been amplified until she could bite through materials that made engineers nervous. Her metabolism had been pushed to a point where she could fight at full intensity, hours without tiring, and her pain response, already almost non-existent, had been functionally reduced to zero. Patches could not feel pain, not suppressed pain, not managed pain, but a genuine neurological absence of the entire concept. And the CBI had not given her this gift. Evolution had. The technology had simply made it complete. She was 18 kilograms of enhanced biological fury, wrapped in armor that laughed at plasma burns. Driven by an aggression so pure and so total that the CBI technicians had flagged her file with a note that simply read, "Do not attempt to separate from bonded partner under any circumstances." But none of that was what had taken Ilara's breath away in the bonding hall. What had stunned her was the love. Patches loved her, fiercely and absolutely, and without any conditions at all. A blaze of protective devotion that roared through the neural link like a furnace. And Ilara had realized in that moment that she had not been given a weak partner. She had been given the most loyal creature on any world, in any star system, in the entire galaxy. A friend who would walk into fire for her, and never once consider turning back. That had been 8 months ago. Now Ilara knelt in the mud and sketched alien wildlife, and Patches sat beside her like a small, angry gargoyle. And life on the frontier was strange, but good. Until Patches went rigid. The honey badger rose onto her hind legs, nose twitching, ears flat. And through the neural link, Ilara felt something she had never felt from her companion before. Not irritation, and not territorial aggression, and not the simmering background fury that was simply Patch's default emotional state, but something deeper, and colder, and far more frightening. Rage. Pure and ancient and absolute. The kind of rage that had no ceiling, and no off switch. The kind that said, "Something is here that should not be here, and I will die before I let it touch what is." Ilara followed the honey badger's gaze to the tree line, and saw the marks. 4 parallel gouges, torn into the bark of a tree as thick as a shuttle hull. Each groove as long as her arm, and as deep as her fist, carved by claws that belonged to nothing in the colony's wildlife database. Something new had come to Kepler 442b, and Patches already hated it. The Vraken had been killing their way across the galaxy for longer than humanity had been writing words on paper, and they were very good at it. They were a reptilian species, cold-blooded in both body and philosophy, standing over 2 meters tall, on legs built for explosive speed, covered head to tail in natural chitinous armor that could stop a blade and shrug off small-caliber rounds. And they grew their own weapons from their bodies, bone blades that jutted from their forearms, spines that ran along their backs, and claws that could be superheated by internal chemical reactions until they glowed with plasma-edged fire. They called themselves the Fangs of the Void, and they had a tradition older than most civilizations. When they discovered a new species on a frontier world, they sent scouts first, and then they sent the warband, and then that species was added to a long and terrible list of things that used to exist. The scouts came to Kepler 442b on a night when both moons were dark. There were 6 of them, each one a Fang scout, trained from birth to hunt and assess and kill, moving through the forest like shadows made of scale and bone. And their leader was a hunter named Sisar, who had 43 species kills carved into the ridges of his skull, and who considered this mission beneath his talents, because preliminary scans had shown the colony's inhabitants to be small and soft and utterly without natural armament. Sisar had looked at the data on humans and felt something close to pity. A species with no claws, and no venom, and no armor, and no ability to regenerate, or camouflage, or produce bioelectric fields. A species that should have gone extinct on its own homeworld before it ever reached the stars. And he could not understand how it had survived long enough to build ships and cross the black between stars. He would understand soon enough. The scouts split into 3 pairs and moved through the forest in a standard assessment pattern. 2 heading south to plant false signal emitters that would draw the colony's militia away from the true approach vector. 2 heading east to map the colony's power grid and defensive positions. And 2 heading north toward the tree line where the forest was thickest and the canopy blocked satellite observation. The colony's sensors picked up the false signals to the south, and the militia mobilized exactly as Sisar had predicted. 40 men and women in light combat armor moving away from the settlement in organized squads, leaving the northern perimeter watched only by automated turrets and a skeleton crew of technicians. Nobody noticed that Alara Voss was not inside the walls. She had gone out at dawn, with Patches to follow a trail of bioluminescent fungi that her mother wanted samples of, moving north along the stream bed into the deep forest, where the canopy turned the morning light green and gold, and the sounds of the colony faded into the endless choir of alien wildlife. When the perimeter alarms triggered, Alara had been 2 kilometers past the boundary markers, crouched beside a fallen log, while Patches dug furiously at something in the soil, and the alarm had sent a spike of cold fear through her chest. But she was a frontier child, and she knew the protocol. Move to the nearest shelter point and wait for the all-clear. The nearest shelter point was back toward the colony, and the path back ran through the ravine. She was halfway through the ravine when Patches stopped moving. The honey badger went flat against the ground, every muscle locked, and through the neural link, Alara felt her companion's senses flood into her own awareness. The smell of something chemical and alien carried on the wind. The faint vibration of heavy footsteps on stone, the heat signature of 2 large bodies moving through the tree cover above the ravine's eastern ridge. Alara pressed herself against the rock wall and held her breath. The 2 Vrakan scouts dropped into the ravine 30 meters ahead of her, landing with a grace that should have been impossible for creatures their size, their clawed feet finding purchase on the wet stone without a sound, their heads swiveling on thick necks as thermal-sensitive pits along their jaws scanned the space around them. They saw her immediately. Through her wrist translator, Alara heard the grinding click of their language rendered into words she could understand, and one of them said to the other, "Juvenile, unarmed, no threat indicators, standard capture protocol," and the other made a sound like rocks being scraped together that the translator flagged as laughter. They began to walk toward her. Ilara's heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth, and every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. But she did not run, because running from a predator was the worst thing a person could do on a frontier world, and because Patches had not moved, and through the neural link, Alara could feel something extraordinary happening inside her companion's mind. The honey badger was not afraid. She was not even angry yet. What Alara felt through the bond was something she had no word for, a cold and absolute stillness, like the moment before a storm breaks. A calculation so precise and so patient that it did not feel like it belonged inside an animal at all. And Alara realized with a shock that Patches was waiting, reading the 2 predators with the same focus that Alara used when she studied wildlife in her notebook, measuring their speed and their reach and the gaps in their armor with an intelligence that the neural link had sharpened to a razor edge. Alara clamped down on her fear and held perfectly still and trusted her partner. The scouts were 15 meters away now, close enough that Alara could see the way the light played across their chitinous plates. Faint glow of the plasma channels that ran along their forearm blades, and they moved with the confidence of creatures that had never in their evolutionary history encountered something they could not kill. 10 meters. Through the neural link, Alara felt Patches shift from calculation to readiness, a change as subtle and as total as a switch being flipped. And the honey badger's body flooded with adrenaline and something else, something the CBI enhancers had amplified beyond any natural limit, a neurochemical cocktail that human scientists had studied for years and still could not fully explain, the thing that made a honey badger walk up to a lion and refuse to leave. 5 meters. Cesar watched from the ridge above through a magnification scope, observing his scouts close in on the small human, and he opened a channel to the warband's command ship in orbit and said, "One juvenile, unarmed, no threat, proceed with capture." Assessment report in his head. Another soft species on another soft world. And then the undergrowth at the base of the ravine wall rustled once, and something stepped out. Patches moved into the open ground between Alara and the 2 Vrakan scouts, and she did not growl, and she did not bare her teeth, and she did not puff up her fur or make herself look larger, the way most animals did when faced with a threat they could not handle. She simply stood there. 18 kilograms of flat-headed, bow-legged, scarred and battered honey badger, looking up at 2 armored predators that outweighed her by a factor of 10. And she planted her feet on the wet stone, and she looked at them with small dark eyes that held nothing but absolute and unconditional refusal. She was not going to move. She was not going to run. She was not going to let them take one more step toward the child behind her. The scouts stopped walking and looked down at the small creature in their path. And the one on the left made the grinding rock sound again, the one the translator called laughter, and he raised one clawed hand with the plasma channels glowing bright along the bone blade, and he said to his partner, "What is this thing?" Patches did not answer, because honey badgers do not speak, but through the neural link, Alara felt her companion's response as clearly as if it had been shouted. It was a single emotion, burning so hot and so bright that it filled Alara's entire mind, and left no room for anything else. It was the promise that whatever happened next was going to hurt. The first scout swung his plasma-edged claw in a downward arc that had split armored creatures twice the size of Patches clean in half on a dozen different worlds. A killing stroke delivered with the casual confidence of a predator that had never once questioned its place at the top of every food chain it had ever encountered. The blow landed. The superheated bone blade struck Patches across the shoulder, with enough force to send a spray of sparks flying from the point of impact. And the sound it made was not the wet crack of flesh parting, but a hard flat clang like metal striking metal. And the plasma edge skidded across the honey badger's enhanced hide and left a black scorch mark on the fur, but did not cut, and did not penetrate, and did not do what it had always done to every other living thing it had ever touched. Patches did not flinch. She did not yelp or stagger or recoil, because to flinch you have to feel pain, and Patches did not feel pain in any meaningful sense. And the CBI enhancers had taken that already terrifying trait and perfected it, until the honey badger's nervous system simply did not contain the wiring necessary to register damage as suffering. What she felt instead was anger. Through the neural link, Alara experienced it like a door being kicked open inside her own chest. A flood of raw and furious aggression, so powerful that it nearly overwhelmed her, and she had to grip the rock wall behind her and force herself to breathe, because the sheer intensity of what Patches was feeling was unlike anything she had ever experienced through the bond. The honey badger lunged. She covered the distance between herself and the first scout in a fraction of a second, a blur of dark fur and bared teeth, and she locked her jaws onto the Vrakan's wrist, just above the plasma blade, with a bite force that the CBI had enhanced to a level that made the technicians back on Earth write concerned menos to each other, and she twisted her entire body like a crocodile, performing a death roll. The chitinous armor around the scout's wrist cracked, then it shattered. Then the bone beneath it broke with a sound like a branch snapping in a storm, and the Vraken screamed, a high, shrill sound that bounced off the ravine walls, and he swung his other arm at Patches in a wild, desperate strike that caught her in the ribs and sent her tumbling across the wet stone. She rolled twice and was back on her feet before she had stopped sliding. The second scout attacked with both claws, driving downward with enough force to crater the stone where Patches had been standing a heartbeat before. But the honey badger had already moved, darting between the Vraken's legs with a speed that seemed impossible for her stocky build, and sinking her teeth into the back of his ankle, where the chitin was thinnest. The scout roared and kicked, and Patches held on, her enhanced claws digging into the gaps between his armored plates, her jaw locked with a grip that nothing short of death was going to release. And through the neural link, Alara felt her companion's mind burning with a fury so pure and so absolute that it had no ceiling and no bottom and no end. Alara understood something in that moment that changed her forever. This was what a honey badger was. Not the claws, and not the teeth, and not the armor-plated hide. Those were just tools. The real weapon was the thing inside, the evolutionary masterpiece that millions of years of survival on one of the most dangerous continents, on one of the most dangerous planets in the galaxy, had forged in the fires of endless competition. The thing that made a 12-kilogram animal charge at lions and fight cobras and raid beehives defended by thousands of stinging insects without hesitation or doubt. It was refusal. The absolute and total refusal to stop, to quit, to yield, to accept that anything in the universe could stand in its way. Universe was more stubborn, or more determined, or more willing to keep fighting than a honey badger. And the CBI had not created this trait, and could not have created it, because it was not a physical attribute, but a spiritual one, burned into the species at a level that no technology could reach. On the ridge above the ravine, Sisar watched through his scope, and his amusement died. He had hunted across 100 worlds. He had faced creatures that could dissolve metal with their saliva, and creatures that could generate electromagnetic pulses from their bodies, and creatures that stood 10 meters tall and shook the ground with every step. And he had killed all of them, because all of them had one thing in common. They could be hurt, and when they were hurt they slowed down, and when they slowed down they could be killed. This thing was not slowing down. It was getting faster. Patches released the second scout's ankle, and dodged a stomping blow that cratered the earth. Stone beside her, and she went for the first scout again, the one with the broken wrist, targeting the joint where his leg met his hip, a spot where the chitin was segmented to allow movement, and where her enhanced teeth could find purchase in the gap. The scout screamed again, and tried to grab her with his good hand, and she let him. She let his clawed fingers close around her body and squeeze with a force that would have crushed the ribcage of any normal animal. And through the neural link, Alara felt the pressure and the heat and the grinding force of it. And she felt Patch's response to all of it, which was nothing, not suppressed pain and not managed pain, but a genuine absolute zero on the scale of suffering. A neurological void where agony should have been and was not. The scout squeezed harder, and Patches bit through 2 of his fingers. Alara was not passive in this. She was Patch's other half, the mind behind the fury. And while the honey badger fought with fury and force, she guided the battle with cool calculation, instinct, and rage. Alara fed her tactical awareness through the bond, marking the positions of both scouts in her mind, tracking their movements, identifying the patterns in their attacks and the gaps in their defenses. And when the second scout lunged from behind, Alara sent a pulse of warning through the link, and Patches twisted free and dodged and countered with a slash across the Vraken's face that opened 3 parallel cuts across his thermal pits and blinded him on the left side. They were a single organism in two bodies, the child and the honey badger. Human intelligence married to animal ferocity. Calm strategic thinking fused with unkillable determination, and together, they were something that the Vraken had never encountered in all their centuries of hunting lesser species. They were something that would not stop and could not be stopped, and knew exactly where to bite. The fight lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, the first scout was crippled. Right wrist shattered, his left hand missing 2 fingers, his hip joint torn open and leaking pale blood onto the ravine floor, and he was dragging himself toward the eastern wall, with the desperate scrambling urgency of something that has realized it is no longer the predator in this encounter. The second scout was in better shape, but not by much, bleeding from a dozen wounds across his legs and torso and face, his left thermal pit destroyed, his movements jerky and panicked in a way that Sisar had never seen from a trained Fang scout. They radioed Sisar from the ravine floor, and Alara's translator rendered their words in a voice stripped of everything but raw and primal terror. "It will not stop," the second scout said. "It will not stop. It does not know how to stop." Patches stood in the center of the ravine, bloodied and singed and breathing hard, standing over the ground she had claimed. And she was diminished in no way that mattered, her dark eyes fixed on the retreating scouts, with an expression that was not triumph, because triumph implies a contest, and what had just happened had not been a contest. It had been a lesson. Sisar descended from the ridge with his weapons drawn, and his 2 remaining scout pairs flanking him. And he stood at the edge of the ravine and looked down at the creature that had just dismantled 2 of his best hunters. And he felt something that he had not felt since he was a hatchling, alone in the dark of the breeding pits. He felt uncertainty. The small creature looked up at him, and it did not growl, and it did not retreat, and it did not show any sign of exhaustion or injury or fear. And Sisar's predatory instincts, which had guided him through 43 successful species assessments, went completely silent because they had no framework for processing what he was seeing. A creature that took damage without response, that fought without self-preservation, that existed in a psychological space that his species had no name for. He opened a channel to the warband's command ship in orbit, and for the first time in his career, he amended an assessment mid-operation. "Correct the file on the humans," Sisar said, and his voice was flat and careful in the way that voices become when the person speaking is trying very hard not to sound afraid. "They are not prey." A pause, and then he added something that would eventually be translated into 400 galactic languages and studied by military analysts for decades. "They keep pets that are not prey." Ilara made it back to the colony walls just before sunset, walking through the northern gate with Patches trotting beside her, and the blood of 2 alien hunters still dark and drying on the honey badger's fur. And the gate guards looked at the girl, and then looked at the animal, and then looked at each other, and did not know what to say. Dr. Kale Voss was waiting inside the gate, and she ran to her daughter and dropped to her knees, and held her so tightly that Alara could feel her mother's heartbeat through both their jackets. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, because there are some fears that language cannot hold, and some relief that words would only make smaller. Then Alara said, "There are things in the forest, Mom, big things with armor and plasma claws, and Patches fought 2 of them, and they ran away." Kale looked down at the honey badger sitting at her daughter's feet, and Patches looked back, with her usual expression of general hostility, toward the they. "Universe," and Kale said, "How badly is she hurt?" Ilara closed her eyes and reached through the neural link, and felt her companion's body the way she always could when she concentrated. Every muscle and bone and organ mapped in her awareness like a second skin. And she said, "Bruised ribs and some burns on her shoulder, and she is hungry. She is always hungry. but she is not hurt in any way that matters to her. 2 hours later, a militia patrol found the crippled Vraken scout in the ravine, still alive, still trying to crawl away from the direction he had last seen Patches. And the soldiers, who carried him back to the colony's medical bay, were veterans who had fought predators on 3 different worlds, and none of them could explain how an animal that weighed less than their field packs had done the damage they were looking at. Colonel Marin Drake, the colony's military commander, interrogated the captured scout through a translation matrix, and learned 3 things that changed everything. The Vraken were a species of apex hunters who had been culling frontier worlds for centuries. There were 6 scouts on the planet, and they had been assessing New Meridian for a full-scale attack, and the main warband numbered over 200 warriors, and was already in orbit on the far side of the planet's largest moon, waiting for the scouts' report. Drake called an emergency council, and every adult in the colony crowded into the central hall, and the room was loud with fear and anger and desperate planning, until Drake held up her hand, and the room went quiet. We have 40 militia, 60 bonded companions, and a perimeter defense grid designed to handle wildlife, not an organized military force, Drake said. And we have approximately 18 hours before they come. In the front row of the assembled colonists, Ilara sat with Patches in her lap, and listened as the adults argued about evacuation routes and distress signals, and whether the nearest human fleet could reach them in time. And through the neural link, she felt Patches' emotional state, which was not fear and not worry, but a low, steady burn of anticipation. The same feeling the honey badger had before she raided a nest or dug out a burrow. The feeling that said, there is a fight coming, and I am ready for it. On the Vraken command ship, Sisar stood before the warband's supreme leader, a massive scarred hunter named Krath Val, who had led the Fangs of the Void for 30 years, and had never failed to conquer a target world. And Sisar delivered his report with the careful precision of someone who knows he will not be believed. The creature weighs approximately 18 of their kilograms, Sisar said. It absorbed plasma edge strikes without visible damage. It sustained injuries that should have been incapacitating, and showed 0 pain response. It fought with a tactical intelligence that suggests neural enhancement or external guidance. And it defeated 2 Fang scouts in close combat without retreating or slowing at any point during the engagement. Krathvol listened, and then made the grinding sound that meant contempt, and said, "One animal is an anomaly, not a threat. The humans are soft, and the culling will proceed at dawn." Sisar said nothing more, but he returned to his quarters, and for the first time in his life, he sharpened his weapons twice. Dawn came to New Meridian, the color of blood. The Vraken warband descended from orbit in drop pods that punched through the atmosphere like burning fists. 200 warriors in full battle array, each one armored and armed and bred for exactly this kind of work. And they landed in a ring around the colony and began their advance through the forest with the synchronized precision of a species that had been perfecting the art of extinction for longer than humanity had existed. They expected to find a settlement full of soft, frightened creatures huddled behind thin walls. What they found was something else entirely. The first wave hit the southern perimeter, and was met by a pack of 12 enhanced wolves, moving in perfect coordination with their human partners. The wolves attacking from multiple angles with speed and ferocity that no natural animal could match, while their bonded humans fed them real-time tactical data through the neural links. And the Vraken scouts, who had expected to sweep through token resistance, instead found themselves in a fight against opponents who could read their movements before they made them. On the eastern flank, a pair of enhanced grizzly bears broke through the Vraken line like living siege engines, each one weighing over 800 kilograms of CBI-amplified muscle and bone, guided by the calm strategic minds of their bonded partners who watched the battlefield through drone feeds and directed every charge and every swipe with surgical precision. Above the colony, a network of enhanced hawks and eagles circled in patterns that no natural flock would fly, their enhanced vision feeding a continuous stream of aerial reconnaissance back to the command center through their bonded handlers, mapping every Vrakan position and movement in real time and feeding it to the defenders below. The Vrakan had conquered species that were individually stronger than humans, species with better natural armor and deadlier natural weapons, and faster reflexes and more acute senses, and they had beaten all of them because the Vrakan were the complete package, fast and strong and armored and organized, and no single species had ever been able to match them across all categories at once. But they had never fought a species that did not try to match them. They had never fought a species that had looked at its own weaknesses and instead of trying to evolve past them, had simply gone out and found other creatures that had already solved each problem and said, "Will you be my partner?" Friend, the wolves provided pack tactics and tracking. The bears provided raw power and siege capability. The hawks provided aerial surveillance and communication. The big cats provided speed and ambush capability. And through it all, the humans provided the one thing that tied every advantage together into a single unified force: intelligence, strategy, the ability to see the whole battlefield and adapt in real time and coordinate dozens of different species into a fighting force that was greater than the sum of its parts. It was the oldest human trick in the book, the same trick they had used when they had tamed wolves to help them hunt, and horses to help them travel, and falcons to help them find prey. The same trick that had carried them from the savannas of Africa to the stars, and it was so simple that the galaxy had missed it entirely. Humans were not the weapon. Humans were the ones who made weapons out of everything else. Larger battles, in the tight spaces and the broken ground, and the places where size was a disadvantage, Patches fought. The honey badger moved through the battlefield like a ghost made of teeth and rage, plugging gaps in the defensive line, harassing Vrakan warriors 10 times her size, drawing attention and fire and fury away from vulnerable positions with the simple, inescapable fact of her presence. Because every Vrakan who saw her remembered Sisar's report, and every Vrakan who fought her discovered that the report had not been an exaggeration. She could not be hurt in any way that mattered to her, and she could not be frightened, and she could not be stopped. And the Vrakan had no answer for something that simply refused to participate in the normal rules of combat. Sisar watched from the tree line as his people's assault broke against the colony's defenses like water against stone, and he opened a channel to every Vrakan frequency and transmitted a single: "We are not hunting. We are being demonstrated to. Withdraw now." Krathval did not listen, not at first, but by midday the warband's casualties had passed the threshold that even his pride could not ignore, and the psychological damage was worse than the physical. Because the Vrakan were not losing to a superior force, they were losing to a philosophy, a way of being in the universe that their entire civilization had no framework to understand. They broke at sunset, retreating to their drop pods and burning for orbit with the desperate speed of predators who have discovered that they are not the only predators in the forest. And as Krathval's ship climbed toward the safety of open space, his communications officer intercepted a transmission from the colony's communication array, a data burst aimed at Earth, and when they decrypted the header, it read, "CBI Program Performance Report. Field test successful. Recommend full deployment across all frontier colonies. Attached, Companion Species Expansion List." Krathval opened the attachment and stared at the number, and the number was 14,000. 14,000 species. The humans had 14,000 creatures on their homeworld that they could bond with and enhance and deploy across every colony on every world they had ever settled. And they had used maybe 30 of them today, and they had won. Krathval closed the file and sat in silence for a very long time. 6 months after the Battle of New Meridian, the galaxy had not stopped talking about what had happened on Kepler 442b. And the more they talked about it, the less they understood it, and the more afraid they became. Not afraid of humanity's strength, because humanity was not strong, not in any way that the galactic community measured strength. They were still soft and slow and fragile, and their senses were mediocre, and their natural armor was non-existent, and a single Vrakan warrior could still tear a single unarmed human apart in seconds. What the galaxy was afraid of was the idea that a species could look at its own weakness and instead of seeing a problem, see an invitation. That a creature with no claws could walk up to a creature with the best claws on the planet and say, "Let us work together," and somehow make it stick, not through dominance and not through control, but through something that the galactic translators kept rendering as bonding or partnership, but which every human who heard the translation shook their head at and said, "No, that is not the right word. The right word is love." The Vrakan did not return to Kepler 442b with warships. They sent a diplomatic envoy, which was something that had never happened before in the entire recorded history of their species. And the envoy was led by Sisar, who had sharpened his weapons twice before the battle, and then had told his people to withdraw and had been proven right. And because of this, Krathvol had stripped him of his rank, and then the Vrakan High Council had stripped Krathvol of his rank, and given it to Sisar instead, because the Vrakan respected results above all things, and Sisar's scouts were the only unit that had come home intact. Sisar requested a meeting, and the request was unusual because he did not ask to speak with Colonel Drake, or with Earth's diplomatic corps, or with any of the officials and politicians who had been flooding into New Meridian, since the battle had made it the most famous colony in human space. He asked to speak with Alara Voss and her companion. In Vrakan culture, you negotiate with the warrior who defeated you, regardless of that warrior's age or size or rank, because to do otherwise would be to dishonor the victory, and the Vrakan were many things, but they were not dishonorable. Alara was 10 years old, and she sat in the colony's central hall, at a table that was too big for her, with her legs swinging above the floor, because her feet did not reach the ground. And across from her sat a 2-meter-tall reptilian predator, with 43 species kills carved into the ridges of his skull, and a new scar on his pride that was deeper than all of them combined. Patches sat on the table between them, eating a snake she had caught outside the hall, crunching through the bones with a steady rhythm that filled the silence like a metronome, and she paid no attention at all to the historic significance of the moment, because honey badgers do not care about history or diplomacy or the balance of galactic power. They care about food and territory and the small, fierce circle of things they have decided belong to them. Sisar looked at the child and then looked at the creature on the table, and he said through the translator, "I have killed 43 species. I have walked on worlds so dangerous that the light itself could burn through armor. I have fought things with teeth longer than my body, and things with poison that could dissolve starship hulls, and I have never been afraid." He paused, and the translator hummed softly in the quiet room. "Your creature taught me fear," he said, "not because she was stronger than the things I have fought. She was not. And not because she was faster or more skilled, she was neither, but because she did not stop, and I could not make her stop, and nothing I know of in this galaxy could make her stop. Be stopped, cannot be defeated, even if it can be killed, and I do not think she can be killed either." Alara listened, and thought about what to say, and then said, "Her name is Patches." Sisar tilted his great scaled head, and something moved behind his eyes that might have been amusement, or might have been respect. And he said, "Patches," and the translator did its best with the word, and what came out was a grinding click that sounded like gravel in a blender. Then Sisar leaned forward and presented his throat. It was the Vrakan gesture of ultimate submission, the most vulnerable part of their body offered to an enemy, An act that said, "I acknowledge that you could end me, and I trust that you will choose not to." And it was a gesture that no Vrakan had ever made to a member of another species in all the centuries of their recorded history. Alara had been coached by her mother and by Colonel Drake and by a very nervous diplomat from Earth who had arrived on the fastest ship available. But in the end, she did not do what any of them had told her to do, because she was 10 years old, and she trusted her instincts more than she trusted adults who had arrived after the fighting was over. She reached across the table and placed her small hand on Sisar's jaw, her fingers resting against the warm, scaled skin just below his thermal pits, and she held it there gently, without pressure or threat, in a gesture that was purely human, and that meant, "I could hurt you, but I choose not to, because choosing not to is what makes us who we are." Sisar closed his eyes, and the room was silent except for the sound of Patches eating her snake. It was the beginning of something that neither species had a name for yet. In the months that followed, the galaxy watched and analyzed and debated, and the military analysts from 30 different civilizations picked apart the Battle of New Meridian and wrote their reports and came to a conclusion that was unanimous and deeply unsettling. The report read, "Humans are not dangerous because of what they are. They are dangerous because of what they convince other things to fight beside them. This capability is not technological in origin. It predates their development of tools and language and fire. It is fundamental to their biology in a way that no other known species has replicated, and it scales." That last word was the one that kept the analysts awake at night. It scales. The CBI program expanded across every human frontier colony within a year. New companion species being bonded and enhanced and deployed in combinations that the galaxy could not have predicted. Dolphins for the aquatic colonies on Tau Ceti, where human settlers worked alongside enhanced marine partners that could outswim and outfight anything in alien oceans. Elephants for the heavy gravity worlds, where their enhanced strength and intelligence made them living construction equipment and devastating. Battlefield assets. Corvids for the intelligence networks, because a raven with enhanced cognition and a neural link to a human analyst was the most effective surveillance system anyone had ever devised, and on, through a list that seemed to have no end. Earth had produced 14,000 species of mammal and bird and reptile that could potentially be bonded, and that was before anyone started talking about insects. Humanity began to appear in galactic databases under a new designation, one that replaced the old classifications of soft and slow and harmless. And the new name was the symbionts. Not the conquerors, not the warriors, not the builders or the thinkers or the explorers, but the symbionts, the species that formed partnerships, the species that reached across the gap between different kinds of life and said, "You are not my tool, and you are not my servant. You are my friend, and together we are something that neither of us could be alone." Became the face of the program, not because she wanted to be famous, and not because anyone asked her to be, but because the story was too good, and too strange, and too perfectly human for the galaxy to ignore. A 9-year-old girl and a 12-kilogram honey badger standing in a ravine against 2 armored predators from a species that had been exterminating civilizations since before humanity invented agriculture, and winning, not through strength and not through technology alone, but through the bond, the ancient and unbreakable covenant between a human and the creature she loved. She gave interviews that she found boring, and attended ceremonies that she found exhausting, and smiled for cameras that she found pointless. And through all of it, Patches sat at her feet, or in her lap, or on her shoulder, and radiated hostility at everyone who came too close and was not Alara. Because honey badgers do not care about fame or politics or the fate of the galaxy. They care about their person. And Ilara was Patch's person, and that was the only thing that had ever mattered. On the last evening before Ilara and her mother were scheduled to leave New Meridian for a tour of the inner colonies, Ilara climbed to the top of the colony's outer wall, and sat with her legs dangling over the edge, and the sunset painting the alien sky in colors that Earth had never seen. Patches curled in her lap, and fell asleep almost immediately, because honey badgers sleep when they want to, and where they want to, and no force in the universe can tell them otherwise. And she snored softly, and her paws twitched as she dreamed of whatever honey badgers dream of, which was almost certainly violence. Through the neural link, Ilara felt her companion's sleeping mind, a warm, dark current of contentment so deep and so complete that it made her eyes sting, and she scratched behind Patch's torn left ear, and looked out across the colony. She could see them everywhere. Teenage boy sitting against a wall with his wolf's head in his lap. An old woman on a rooftop with her hawk perched on her wrist, grooming its feathers in the fading light. Twin sisters walking the perimeter road with their matched leopards padding silent beside them. And everywhere the same quiet miracle. Human and animal, two different kinds of life, choosing each other, trusting each other, becoming something greater than either could be. Alone. Humanity had not conquered the stars by being the strongest or the fastest or the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. They had done it by being the friendliest. And somewhere in the deep black between stars, a Vracan intelligence report circulated through the communication networks of the elder species, passed from civilization to civilization, translated into 400 languages, read by admirals and generals and war leaders and heads of state who had spent their careers believing that the universe belonged to the powerful. The report contained a single recommendation, 7 lines long, and by the end of its first year in circulation, it had been quoted more than any other military document in galactic history. The recommendation read, "Do not hunt the humans, not because they are strong, not because they are clever, but because whatever you are, whatever claws you bear, whatever armor you wear, whatever venom you carry, they have already found something on their little blue world that does it better, and they have taught it to love them." On the wall of a frontier colony on the edge of everything that mattered, a girl held a sleeping honey badger in her lap, and watched the stars come out, and knew in her bones that she was not alone, and had never been alone, and that no human anywhere in the galaxy would ever be alone again, because they brought their friends.